Donald Trump has never been one to back down from a fight, and when it comes to brutal Mexican cartels, his approach is nothing short of extreme. From terrorist delegations that put cartels in grave danger, to deadly military attacks like drone strikes and missiles, which promise to leave millions dead, Trump's proposed methods for eliminating cartel members are absolutely insane. This video will leave you shocked, so brace up as we explore some of Trump's deadliest elimination strategies ever. Trump's methods for destroying cartels. A few months ago, there were reports that Donald Trump plans to send kill squads into Mexico to eliminate drug lords. The supposed move was reported by several news outlets who disclosed that Trump wishes to send the squad with or without the permission of the Mexican government. Donald Trump has told allies about his plans to covertly send special forces to Mexico to assassinate drug kingpins. The newly elected president said this last year during his campaign for second term. His plan is straightforward: to covertly deploy American assassination squads into Mexico soon after he's sworn into office again. Both during and after his first year in office, Trump floated different ideas for bombing or invading Mexico in response to the American fentanyl crisis. He also promised to wage war on notorious drug cartels. According to Trump's former defense secretary Mark Esper, the U.S. president's idea involves bombing the cartel's drug labs and then potentially pinning the strikes on another country. He intends to make appropriate use of special forces, cyber warfare, and other overt and covert actions to inflict maximum damage on cartel leadership, infrastructure, and operations. Beyond killing cartel leaders, Trump has other crazy ideas for dealing with Mexican cartels. One that he recently announced is labeling Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs. During his recent inauguration speech, Trump promised to designate cartels as terrorist organizations. The U.S. president had previously threatened to designate cartels as FTOs as far back as 2019, when 9 U.S. citizens from an isolated Mormon community in Mexico were murdered. At the time, it appeared the president was ready to implement the policy, but he held off at the request of the then Mexican president, Andres López Obrador. Now Trump is fully ready to implement this policy. Trump's plan to designate cartels as FTOs has been met with different criticism. First, Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, openly rejected the idea outright, stating that while the country is ready to work with the U.S., it is not willing to be subordinate. The Mexican president further noted that Mexico is a free, sovereign, independent country, and therefore will not accept any form of interference. After Trump disclosed his plans, there have been speculations that the move will not give the U.S. the tools to go after organized crime. Plus, it may simply be a threat to force more action from Mexico itself. Another plan that is currently discussed is the deployment of special operations. Trump has vowed to deploy special operations troops and naval forces to declare war on the cartels. He also plans to launch military strikes against cartel leaders and infrastructure. After naming cartels as terrorist organizations, Trump plans to send troops into Mexico, seize cartel assets, and impose sanctions on individuals working with them. Some of Trump's allies, like his vice presidential pick J.D. Vance, have argued that Mexico is at risk of becoming a full-fledged narco state due to the power of these cartels, and they believe military action is necessary to stop the flow of fentanyl and other drugs into the U.S. However, while there are those who support this plan, there are others who believe that sending U.S. troops into Mexico is a far more controversial idea, more like a violation of Mexico's sovereignty. These critics argue that such an approach would destabilize relations between the U.S. and Mexico and could escalate violence in the region. The cartels, particularly factions within the Sinaloa cartel, have grown increasingly sophisticated, using bomb-dropping drones, armored vehicles, and even improvised explosive devices. So the idea of a military operation in Mexico has fueled concerns over escalating cartel violence, with many believing that a diplomatic approach would be more effective. Another one of Trump's audacious ideas against cartels is to launch missiles into Mexico. Former Defense Secretary revealed this in a video, stating that Trump has once suggested launching missile strikes in Mexico against drug cartels. The first time Donald Trump talked privately about shooting missiles into Mexico was as far back as 2020, and the first time those comments became public was when Mark Esper, Trump's second defense secretary, wrote in his memoir that the president had raised it with him and asked if the United States could make it look as if some other country was responsible. Esper portrayed the idea as ridiculous, but while he condemned it, some Republicans reportedly welcomed it, and it didn't matter whether the Mexican government approved it or not. On his inauguration day, Trump said foreign drug cartels are killing 250,000 to 300,000 American people per year. After that, White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt said fentanyl has killed tens of millions of Americans. These statistics have forced Trump to implement strict tariff policies, as he now plans to limit cartel supply by targeting companies in China, Canada, and India that are supplying precursor chemicals for fentanyl production. In In a statement issued by the White House, it was disclosed that Trump plans to implement sweeping trade tariffs to curb what he describes as a national emergency. However, while this method has been applauded, there are those who question the need for this strategy, and these criticisms particularly stem from countries' participation in the U.S. drug trade. It's widely known that drug cartels in Mexico produce the vast majority of street fentanyl flowing into the United States. However, the same cannot be said about Canada. While the Trump administration suggests Canada has a growing footprint in narcotics distribution, law enforcement have argued that the country plays a minimal role in fentanyl smuggling into the U.S. According to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, smuggling from Canada contributes less than 1% of the fentanyl street supply in the U.S. And even data from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration supports this claim. On the other hand, while Canada has little role to play, law enforcement agencies and government officials in the U.S. agree that most of the precursor chemicals used to make street fentanyl actually flow from industrial companies in China. For years, China's government has resisted efforts to target and disrupt this supply chain. It was only during the Biden administration that Chinese officials implemented new regulations to help crack down on money laundering by drug organizations. They also made some arrests. But beyond China's involvement, it appears Trump has a bigger issue with Mexico. Trump's administration recently accused the Mexican government of forming an alliance with drug cartels. The U.S. president has previously accused the Mexican government of not doing enough to combat drug cartels. He claimed that cartels operate freely in Mexico, which means the government either turns a blind eye or collaborates with them. These accusations were part of Trump's broader stance on immigration and border security. Many claim that these allegations may have stemmed from Trump's perception that the Mexican government has more intelligence than it acts on. The narrative is that Mexico has enough military power to tackle cartel violence, but chooses not to utilize it. However, while this narrative has gained popularity, there are speculations that Mexico's inaction may just be an issue of differing priorities. While the U.S. wants to go after top drug traffickers, Mexico primarily wants to reduce violence. And in practice, these objectives often run counter to one another. Similarly, while the U.S. government has accused Mexico of forming an alliance with cartels, the Mexican government has also accused the U.S. of harboring drug cartels and American citizens of working with organized crime groups in Mexico. This statement was made by Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum, who noted that as much as there is violence in Mexico, there is also organized crime in the U.S. Look at it this way: illegal drugs coming in from Mexico don't just stay with Mexicans. They are also distributed in the United States by Americans, which means Mexicans aren't the only ones involved in this drug chain. These comments by the Mexican president followed a report which showed that arrests of U.S. citizens for offenses related to organized crime had increased by more than 450% during the tenure of Andrés López, the former president of Mexico. Sheinbaum called on Washington not just to help crack down on cartels in Mexico, but also to do its job in the U.S., to make the arrests that need to be made in order to halt the trafficking of drugs in its own country. This strategy is something Trump would likely embrace in his new administration. By designating cartels as FTOs, the U.S. president plans to employ economic measures like freezing assets, cutting off funding, and using legal tools to prosecute people who are providing material support to cartels. In the past, there have been a series of arrests made with respect to cartel involvement. One is the case of Genaro Garcia Luna, the former security chief, who was recently sentenced to 38 years in U.S. prison for receiving bribes from the Sinaloa cartel. There were also allegations against Salvador Cienfuegos, the former defense minister, who was arrested on drug trafficking charges at the Los Angeles airport. His case was particularly disturbing, as he was quickly released under pressure from the Mexican government. While Trump has been coming up with several absurd methods to get rid of drug cartels, researchers and experts have responded with interesting observations. Experts react to Trump's insane methods. After Trump announced plans to designate Mexican cartels as terrorists, experts have described the move as a scare tactic. Guadalupe Correa Cabrera, a political science professor at George Mason University, has said that the cartel designation may be used as a negotiating tool for the U.S., probably to frighten the Mexican government. It could serve as a scare tactic aimed at pressuring the Mexican government, more like political messaging than practical policy. Similarly, Oswaldo Zavala, an expert on drug cartels, has pointed out that the U.S. has a history of using cartels as a political tool. He noted that cartel violence is often exaggerated or selectively framed to serve U.S. interests. Zavala further mentioned that if the real goal were to curb drug trafficking, the U.S. would also have to target the financial networks and domestic enablers that allow these organizations to operate. One major concern is that labeling cartels as terrorist organizations could justify unilateral U.S. military action in Mexico. This single fact has raised alarms among Mexican officials who see it as a direct threat to their sovereignty policy. Even Trump himself has acknowledged that while Mexico will not be comfortable with his methods, these extreme measures are necessary to combat cartel violence and the fentanyl crisis in the U.S. Mexico has long resisted the idea of foreign military involvement in its fight against cartels. The country has already suffered immense violence, with over 100,000 people missing due to cartel-related conflicts. So right now, many people in Mexico view the country's militarized drug war, which is largely influenced by past U.S. policies, as a key driver of this violence rather than a solution. Recently, Texas Governor Greg Abbott sent 400 Texas National Guard troops to the Texas-Mexico border to join the 1,500 active duty service members already sent there by Trump. During the same period, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement announced close to 1,000 arrests, with at least one of those involving a member of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. This is one of the criminal groups that Trump's executive order recently designated as a terrorist organization. These reports are strong evidence that Trump is determined to put an end to Mexican cartels, and he is ready to do anything to achieve that. Trump's foreign aid freeze recently stopped anti-fentanyl work in Mexico, a move that has raised a lot of controversies. For years, the INL, which is the U.S. State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, has been working to curb the flow of the synthetic opioid into the United States. Its programs focus heavily on breaking the fentanyl supply chain. The organization also engages in activities such as training Mexican authorities to find and destroy fentanyl labs, as well stopping precursor chemicals used to manufacture the illicit drug from entering Mexico. However, despite these incredible functions, all of the INL programs in Mexico are currently halted due to the funding freeze. In response to this move, experts have noted that the pause will limit the U.S. capacity to manage the fentanyl crisis. In his explanation, Daphne Rand, former director of the Office of Foreign Assistance at the State Department, disclosed that the U.S. foreign assistance programs in Mexico are countering the fentanyl supply chain. He also stated that the programs were training local security services and ensuring maximum U.S.-Mexican cooperation in the fight against this deadly drug. What this means is that without proper action, Trump's decision to halt INL programs could have serious damaging effects on the U.S. Similar to how experts have kicked against this recent halt, they have also criticized Trump's plan to launch missile attacks. Donald Trump's proposal to use military force, including missile strikes, against Mexican drug cartels has been widely criticized by experts and officials on both sides of the border, with many arguing that this approach is both unrealistic and highly dangerous. One major concern is that Mexican cartels, especially powerful organizations like the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, are far more militarized than many assume. These groups are equipped with military-grade weapons, including grenade launchers, armored vehicles, and even surface-to-air missiles. Some reports indicate that cartels even receive training from former military personnel, making them formidable opponents. Based on all of these reports, experts warned that engaging in military action against cartels could lead to a prolonged conflict, similar to what the U.S. experienced in Afghanistan and Iraq. Another issue is the impact on U.S.-Mexico relations. Mexico's government has strongly opposed any form of U.S. military intervention. Even the president has made it clear that Mexico would not allow such an attack. Already, there have been reports that the U.S. Air Force has been flying reconnaissance missions over cartel-controlled areas using advanced spy planes. The flights, conducted over a 10-day period in late January and early February, had reportedly occurred after President Donald Trump directed the military to secure the border and stop cartels' drug smuggling operations. This move highlights how the military has already begun shifting U.S. national security resources away from overseas threats to focus on the southern border, where Trump has declared a national emergency. According to reports, at least 11 of these recent flights around the U.S. have been by Navy P-8S, a particularly unique plane with a sophisticated radar system that not only specializes in identifying submarines, but is also capable of collecting imagery and signals intelligence. Similarly, on the 3rd of February, a nearly 6-hour flight was conducted by a U-2 spy plane, one of the U.S. military's most venerated reconnaissance aircraft. This plane was reportedly designed during the Cold War and was used to collect high-altitude imagery of the Soviet Union. Some experts suggest that these intelligence-gathering efforts could be used for some sort of direct intervention against cartels. Beyond the practical and diplomatic concerns, critics have argued that targeting cartels with military force does little to address the root causes of drug trafficking. And so instead of launching missiles or pushing for other military actions, experts suggest a more cooperative approach, something that is focused on intelligence sharing, economic initiatives, and law enforcement cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico. While Trump has criticized Mexico's methods of handling cartels, some experts suggest that his administration may plan to push for deeper collaboration with Mexican law enforcement. The idea is simple. While Trump seeks to impose tariffs and tough toughen immigration policies, Mexico's government under Claudia Sheinbaum is prepared to push back, leveraging trade dependencies and regional cooperation to negotiate better terms. As it stands, Trump's second term is expected to put renewed pressure on Mexico over immigration, trade, and security. However, Mexico's growing economic and strategic importance still limits how far the U.S. can act unilaterally, so both countries will likely have to meet each other somewhere in the middle. Before becoming an official candidate in 2015, Trump labeled immigrants from Mexico as molesters and drug traffickers who steal and kill. This comment deepened the discussions on immigration, further proving that for both countries to work together, there has to be some level of compromise. If the U.S. and Mexico work together against cartels, there is the possibility of forming joint military operations. Some U.S. lawmakers have recently proposed an authorization for use of military force, AUMF, to target Mexican drug cartels, similar to how the U.S. has fought terrorist organizations in 2001. The proposed AUMF would allow the president to use military force, including cyber and intelligence operations, against cartel groups in Mexico. No doubt, Mexico has been largely opposed to direct U.S. military intervention. However, public opinion in the country is divided. For instance, a Reforma poll was recently conducted, and it was found that nearly two-thirds of respondents support a joint U.S.-Mexico security effort, despite others seeing U.S. intervention as a violation of Mexican sovereignty. But of course, there are risks. A direct military operation could strain diplomatic relations between the two countries, and some experts warn that it might push cartels to retaliate with extreme violence. Speaking of cartel retaliation, what could be the possible aftermath if Trump proceeds to wage war on cartels? Let's talk about that. Trump versus Mexican cartel, the possible aftermath. If Trump launches a military-style war against the Mexican cartels, the likelihood of cartel retaliation is extremely high. Mexican cartels operate as highly organized paramilitary entities with significant financial resources, access to heavy weaponry, and deep infiltration into both Mexican and U.S. territories. It is unlikely that such groups would ignore U.S. attacks. Historically, when targeted by military forces, cartels have responded with brutal violence, including assassinations, mass killings, and coordinated attacks on law enforcement and government officials. A good example is the incident that occurred in 2006. Soon after Felipe Calderón became president of Mexico in that year, he declared a war on drugs, deploying military forces against cartels. The result of this move was brutally disastrous. Cartel members quickly retaliated by targeting law enforcement, military personnel, and government officials. Entire police forces resigned in fear, and public officials were assassinated in broad daylight. Aside from the physical violence, cartels also employed psychological tactics, using brutal killings and public displays of bodies to instill terror among the population. Throughout Mexico's history, cartels have demonstrated an ability to adapt and retaliate against perceived threats. And so, if Trump were to order direct U.S. military action against the cartels, the result could be disastrous, and retaliation could even extend beyond Mexico. Think about it. Cartels have well-established networks within the U.S., particularly in cities like Los Angeles and Chicago. If they leverage these cities for targeted assassinations, bombings, or even cyber attacks, this move could have a serious effect on the United States. So basically, if Trump moves forward with a cartel war, Mexico could see an escalation in violence, while the U.S. could face a new wave of cartel-driven attacks, both on American soil and against U.S. personnel abroad. Before now, Trump has threatened high tariffs on Mexican imports if the Mexican government does not take stronger action against cartels. And now, he has taken it a step further by implementing these policies. Until the crisis is alleviated, Trump plans to implement a 25% additional tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico, and a 10% additional tariff on imports from China. With this policy, Trump wants to hold Mexico, Canada, and China accountable to their promises of halting illegal immigration and stopping poisonous fentanyl and other drugs from flowing into the U.S. He intends to treat illicit drug distribution as a national emergency, more like a public health crisis. According to Trump's aides, Chinese officials have failed to take the actions necessary to disrupt the flow of precursor chemicals to criminal cartels. Similarly, the Mexican government has provided safe havens for the cartels to engage in the manufacturing and transportation of dangerous narcotics. This freedom has led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of American victims. In Canada as well, there is a growing presence of Mexican cartels operating fentanyl and nitazene synthesis labs. A recent study has revealed the country now has a heightened domestic production of fentanyl, plus a growing presence in international narcotics distribution. All of these have resulted in Trump's tariff policies. However, while these tariffs may seem like a brilliant idea, it's possible that the affected countries retaliate. If trade countries retaliate and cartel members fight back, the U.S. could find itself in a very dangerous position. Some experts like Bill O'Reilly have suggested that if cartel leaders refuse to back down, then Trump could authorize the use of drones for targeted strikes on the cartel. Bill mentioned in his statement that if cartels fail to recede, then people may start seeing dead bodies all over the place in Mexico. The idea of using weaponized drones against Mexican drug cartels has been discussed in political circles, especially with Trump's return to power. While there hasn't been an official policy announcement, his allies have suggested that cartels should be treated as terrorist organizations, a tag that could open the door for military-style action, including drone strikes. During his campaign, Trump made it clear that he intends to take a hard stance against cartels. However, while drone strikes could be a tool to counter cartel activities, deploying them in Mexico would be unprecedented and highly controversial. Who knows, maybe the president will end up deploying these drones at the border. Trump has promised to continue expanding the U.S.-Mexico border wall. His goal is to make it harder for cartels to smuggle drugs into the U.S. The U.S. president has ordered the completion of the border wall, which was a key part of his first-term policies. However, this time, he's also involving the U.S. military in a much larger role. The idea is for the Defense Department to assist the Department of Homeland Security in securing the border and providing logistical support such as detention space, transportation, and surveillance. Although the exact number of troops to be deployed remains uncertain, Trump has made it known that he intends to seal the border and use military resources to reduce mass migration. In recent years, technology has become a powerful tool for controlling migration, strengthening border security, and increasing surveillance within countries. Although some of these methods have been around for a long time, new advancements in technology are now being integrated into immigration enforcement, and this is happening at an unprecedented pace. Decisions that were once made by immigration officers, border agents, or administrative tribunals are now increasingly being handled by artificial intelligence. For example, enforcement agencies like Europe's Frontex are using predictive analytics to determine human behavior and determine whether migrants are allowed to cross borders. Biometric technology has also become more widespread, allowing authorities to identify individuals based on their biological and behavioral characteristics. This includes fingerprint scanning, retinal and facial recognition, and even more advanced methods like analyzing vein patterns, ear shapes, and a person's walking style. Some experimental technologies go even further, such as AI-powered lie detectors designed to assess truthfulness at border crossings. These are technologies that Trump intends to invest in. Already, Trump's administration has explored using undercover informants to reveal hidden cartel tunnels in the U.S.-Mexico border. Recently, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration discovered some cross-border tunnels and subterranean passageways where cartel members keep illicit drugs that are later smuggled into the U.S. These tunnels, called cover-ups, often look like normal storefronts or warehouses, but they're not. They are underground locations that are used to hide tunnel entrances and exits. ICE reported that one tunnel extends the length of approximately 8 football fields. The tunnel has an average depth of 31 feet and is 3 feet wide along most of the passageway. These tunnels are not simple underground holes, but rather complicated underground cities, complete with air ducts, office space, weapon stashes, and even railway tracks. Former DEA Senior Special Agent Michael Brown disclosed that cartels move hundreds of kilos of drugs out of these tunnels and build warehouses. These warehouses are then given regular business names, making it hard for law enforcement to discover any drug trafficking activities. Brown also noted that the sophistication of these tunnels proves that cartels have more money than Hamas, especially since those tunnels likely cost hundreds or millions of dollars to build. Trump's new administration is determined to keep the U.S. border as tight as possible, and he's exploring every possible option to achieve this. The Mexican government recently claimed that the U.S. may have spied on drug cartels near the border. Mexican officials disclosed this, stating that they're aware of 2 such U.S. military flights. When asked whether the aircraft had spied on Mexican drug traffickers, they revealed that it's a possibility they're currently looking into. Luckily for the U.S., the plane that Mexico observed flying near its territory did not violate national airspace and kept its tracking devices on. This single fact caused many to speculate that maybe the information gathered from Mexican territory would have to be shared under agreements between the 2 countries. Interestingly, despite Trump's promises to crack down on Mexican cartels, going as far as proposing military action and labeling them as terrorist organizations, there's little evidence that these groups are actually concerned. In fact, a recent report has suggested that these cartels are not worried about Trump. The report, which surfaced after reporters spent 2 nights with cartel members, revealed that these men are unbothered by whatever Trump is planning. They are determined to carry out their activities irrespective of what the U.S. president has in mind. Over the years, cartels have grown more powerful and have diversified their operations beyond drug trafficking trafficking. They have expanded into human smuggling, oil theft, and even extortion. This deep-rooted influence in Mexico, both economically and politically, makes it unlikely that Trump's threats would drastically change their operations. If anything, it could probably slow down operation for some time. Mexican drug cartels have posed a major challenge for the Trump administration, especially as the U.S. president is determined to curb the flow of illegal narcotics into the country. At the moment, there are several speculations about how realistic Trump's plans are. While there are those who have applauded these proposed plans, there are others who have heavily criticized them. What are your thoughts on these absurd elimination methods that Trump plans to implement? Let me know in the comments section. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, then be sure to click on this next card on your screen.